The classroom was unusually quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of pencils on desks and the occasional shuffle of papers. Mrs. Harper's sharp heels echoed ominously as she paced between the rows of students, her hawk-like gaze scanning the room. The air felt heavy, suffused with a palpable tension that made even the most confident students keep their heads down. Jamal, sitting in the third row by the window, kept his focus on his test paper, his hand gliding steadily as he filled in answers. Mrs. Harper suddenly stopped, her heels clicking together sharply. Her gaze fell on Jamal, and for reasons known only to her, a scowl crept across her face. She crossed her arms and stood directly behind him, watching his every move. Jamal felt the weight of her stare but refused to look up, knowing that any acknowledgement of her presence would only invite trouble. Finally, her voice broke the silence, cutting through the room like a blade. "Jamal Daniels," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Jamal's pencil froze mid-air. He looked up at her, confused. "I'm working on the test, ma'am." Her lips curled into a sneer. "Working on the test, are you? Funny, because I can't help but wonder how someone like you managed to come up with those answers so quickly." The room went deathly silent. All eyes were on Jamal now. Some of his classmates exchanged nervous glances, while others smirked, clearly entertained by the unfolding drama. Jamal's face burned with humiliation, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I studied for this test," he said, his voice steady but laced with quiet indignation. "Just like everyone else." Mrs. Harper let out a derisive laugh. "Studied? Please, let's not pretend you didn't have some sort of help. Maybe you copied from someone, or perhaps you found a way to cheat. After all, people like you are always looking for shortcuts." Jamal felt his stomach churn. He knew exactly what she meant by people like you, and judging by the way a few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, so did everyone else. He clenched his fists under the desk, willing himself not to react. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to explode so she could paint him as the problem. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. "I didn't cheat," he said firmly, "and I'd appreciate it if you stopped accusing me without any proof." Mrs. Harper's eyes narrowed, her face tightening with barely concealed anger. "Proof? Oh, I'll find proof," she said. "Mark my words. You won't get away with this." With that, she stormed back to her desk, leaving Jamal to sit in the simmering tension she had created. He could feel the stares of his classmates, some sympathetic, others curious, and a few downright judgmental. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and escape the oppressive weight of their scrutiny. But he couldn't. He wouldn't. As the class continued, Jamal tried to focus on finishing his test, but his mind was racing. Why did she hate him so much? What had he ever done to deserve this kind of treatment? He had always tried to keep his head down, to stay out of trouble, but no matter what he did, it was never enough. Mrs. Harper always found a reason to target him, and today was no exception. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Jamal hurriedly gathered his things and headed for the door. But as he stepped into the hallway, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see his best friend, Marcus, standing there with a concerned expression. "Hey man," Marcus said. "You okay?" Jamal shrugged, trying to play it off. "Yeah, I'm fine. It's nothing I can't handle." Marcus frowned. It didn't look like nothing. She was way out of line, Jamal. You don't have to put up with that. What am I supposed to do? Jamal asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Go to the principal and tell him my teacher's a racist? What good would that do? Marcus hesitated, then said quietly, you could tell your dad. Jamal stiffened. No, I don't want him involved. Marcus gave him a skeptical look. Why not? He's the principal. If anyone can do something about this, it's him. Jamal sighed, running a hand over his face. I don't want people treating me differently because of who my dad is. I've worked hard to earn my place here, and I don't want anyone thinking I'm just coasting on his name. Besides, if she finds out he's my dad, it'll only make things worse. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding Jamal's dilemma but still uneasy about the situation. All right, man. But if it gets worse, you've got to do something. Promise me you won't just let her get away with this. Jamal managed a small smile. I promise. As the two friends walked down the hallway, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. Mrs. Harper wasn't the type to let things go, and he had a sinking suspicion that she would come after him again. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside, determined to focus on the rest of his day. Unbeknownst to him, Mrs. Harper was already scheming. Sitting at her desk, she replayed the interaction in her mind, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. How dare he talk back to her like that? She would make an example of him, prove once and for all that he didn't belong here. She didn't know who Jamal Daniels truly was, but she was about to find out in the most unexpected way. The following morning, the atmosphere in the classroom was tense and unwelcoming. Jamal walked into the room with his head held high, determined not to show any signs of the turmoil he felt inside. Yet, the weight of Mrs. Harper's glares and the whispers of his classmates lingered in the air. He took his usual seat near the window, looking out momentarily to calm his nerves. The sky was gray, and the faint rumble of thunder in the distance seemed to mirror his emotions. Mrs. Harper entered the room with her usual briskness, her heels tapping against the floor in a way that commanded attention. The students immediately fell silent, their conversations cut short by her presence. She placed her bag on the desk and scanned the room, her eyes lingering on Jamal for just a moment longer than necessary. He could feel her contempt without her saying a word, and he braced himself for what was to come. Class, she began, her voice icy and authoritative. Today we will continue our discussion on dreams and aspirations. I'd like each of you to share what you hope to achieve in the future. Let's start with, she paused, her eyes sweeping the room before landing on Jamal. Jamal Daniels. Jamal felt his stomach drop. He hadn't expected to be singled out so soon, but he refused to let her see his discomfort. He straightened in his seat and met her gaze. What are your dreams, Jamal? She asked, her tone laced with an undertone of mockery. Surely you must have some lofty goals. Jamal hesitated for a moment, then said confidently, I want to become an engineer. I want to design technology that helps make life easier for people. Some of his classmates nodded in approval, but Mrs. Harper's expression hardened. An engineer, you say? That's ambitious. She tilted her head, her lips curving into a condescending smile. But tell me, Jamal, do you think you have what it takes? Engineering requires a lot of intelligence and discipline. It's not something just anyone can do. Jamal clenched his fists under the desk. Her words stung, but he refused to let her tear him down. Yes, I do think I have what it takes, he replied firmly. I've always been good at math and science, and I'm willing to work hard to achieve my goals. Mrs. Harper's smile faltered for a brief moment before she regained her composure. Well, I suppose time will tell, she said dismissively. moving on to the next student without another word. But the damage had been done. The subtle yet cutting remarks left a bitter taste in Jamal's mouth, and he could feel the weight of her judgment lingering over him like a storm cloud. As the day went on, the tension between Jamal and Mrs. Harper only grew. During a group discussion, she interrupted him repeatedly, dismissing his ideas without explanation. When he volunteered to answer a question, she ignored his raised hand and called on another student instead. It was clear to everyone in the room that she was targeting him, and though some of his classmates seemed uncomfortable, none of them spoke up. By lunchtime, Jamal had had enough. He sat in the cafeteria with Marcus, picking at his food and venting his frustrations. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he admitted. "She's making it her mission to humiliate me." Marcus frowned. "I recorded what she said in class earlier," he said. About engineering not being for just anyone. It was messed up, and people need to know what she's doing." Jamal looked up in surprise. "You recorded her?" "Yeah. I figured it might be useful just in case." "Look, Jamal, you don't have to fight this battle alone. If she keeps this up, we can take it to the administration. They need to know what's going on." Jamal hesitated. He appreciated Marcus' support, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to take that step. He had always been taught to handle things on his own, to prove himself through hard work and determination. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up to someone who was abusing her power. "Let me think about it," he said finally. "I'm not sure what the right move is yet." Marcus nodded, respecting Jamal's need for time. "Just know I've got your back, man. Whatever you decide, I'm here for you." That afternoon, as Jamal returned to class, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were building toward a breaking point. Mrs. Harper seemed to sense it too. Her paranoia was evident in the way she glanced around the room, as if expecting someone to challenge her. But she remained steadfast in her mission to undermine Jamal, and her behavior only grew more erratic. During a group project, she assigned Jamal to work alone while the other students paired up, claiming it would give him a chance to prove his independence. When he turned in an assignment, she scrutinized it for errors, pointing out minor mistakes with exaggerated criticism. Her actions were deliberate and calculated, designed to erode his confidence and paint him as inadequate. But Jamal was determined not to let her win. He poured himself into his work, staying up late to study and seeking help from his father's old textbooks to deepen his understanding of the material. Each time she tried to knock him down, he used it as fuel to push himself further. He knew he couldn't control her behavior, but he could control how he responded to it. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Harper, her actions were not going unnoticed. Several students had begun to whisper among themselves, sharing their observations of her treatment toward Jamal. Some quietly supported him, offering encouraging words when she wasn't around. Others started documenting her behavior, taking notes on the incidents they witnessed. It was becoming increasingly clear that Mrs. Harper was walking a dangerous line, and her students were no longer willing to turn a blind eye. One evening, during a parent-teacher meeting, Mrs. Harper's world began to unravel. She was seated at her desk, flipping through papers, when the door opened and Mr. Daniels stepped into the room. She looked up, her expression polite but guarded, unaware of the connection between him and Jamal. "Good evening, Mrs. Harper," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Elijah Daniels, the new principal. I wanted to discuss one of your students." Mrs. Harper froze, her mind racing. She forced a smile and shook his hand. "Of course, Mr. Daniels. Please have a seat. Which student would you like to discuss?" Mr. Daniels took a seat across from her, his expression calm yet firm. "My son, Jamal Daniels." The color drained from Mrs. Harper's face. She opened her mouth to speak but found herself at a loss for words. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the revelation hanging heavy in the air. She quickly regained her composure, offering a strained smile. "Oh, Jamal," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Yes, he's a promising student. I wasn't aware he was your son." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "I'm sure you weren't. That's by design. Jamal prefers to keep our relationship private so he can be treated like any other student. But I've recently been made aware of some concerning behavior in your classroom, and I think we need to have a serious conversation about it." Mrs. Harper's hands tightened around the papers in front of her. She nodded stiffly, her mind racing as she tried to anticipate what he knew and how much she could deny. But deep down, she knew she had underestimated Jamal Daniels, and she was about to face the consequences of her actions. The next morning, the school was abuzz with whispers and speculation. News of Jamal's connection to the new principal had spread, though no one was quite sure how the information had come to light. The revelation added an extra layer of tension to the already volatile relationship between Jamal and Mrs. Harper. As Jamal walked through the hallways, he felt the curious stares of his classmates following him. Some looked impressed, others skeptical, and a few downright hostile. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the day ahead and the storm he knew was brewing. By the time he entered Mrs. Harper's classroom, it was clear that she had also heard the news. She stood at her desk, her posture stiff and her face tight with forced composure. Jamal could see the flicker of unease in her eyes as she watched him take his seat. For a moment, he thought she might say something, but instead, she turned her attention to the stack of papers in front of her and began the day's lesson. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Harper's usual confidence seemed to have been replaced by an underlying nervousness, and her attempts to maintain control of the classroom felt strained. Her voice wavered as she spoke, and her typically sharp commands lacked their usual bite. The students noticed the change, exchanging curious glances but saying nothing. Jamal, for his part, remained silent, observing her carefully and waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Came sooner than he expected. Near the end of class, Mrs. Harper called on Jamal to answer a question about the day's lesson. Her tone was clipped, and her expression was hard to read. Jamal answered confidently, his voice steady despite the weight of her gaze. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without warning, she launched into a tirade. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Jamal?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Just because your father is the principal, you think you're untouchable. But let me tell you something. In my classroom, everyone is treated the same, no matter who their parents are." The room fell silent. Jamal's classmates stared in shock, some looking uncomfortable and others intrigued by the drama unfolding before them. Jamal met her gaze, refusing to back down. "With all due respect, Mrs. Harper," he said calmly, "that hasn't been my experience. If everyone is treated the same, why do you go out of your way to single me out?" Mrs. Harper's face turned red, and she opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, the door to the classroom opened. Mr. Daniels stepped inside, his expression calm but serious. The entire room turned to look at him, and Mrs. Harper's anger seemed to evaporate instantly, replaced by a strained smile. "Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice overly bright. "What a surprise. What brings you to my classroom? Mr. Daniels' gaze swept over the room before settling on Mrs. Harper. I need to speak with you, Mrs. Harper, he said. Privately. She hesitated, clearly torn between maintaining her authority in front of her students and complying with the principal's request. Finally, she nodded. Of course. Class, please continue reviewing the material. I'll be back shortly. The two of them stepped out into the hallway, and the door closed behind them. Inside the classroom, the students erupted into whispers, speculating about what was happening. Jamal sat quietly, his heart pounding as he tried to process what had just occurred. He couldn't hear the conversation taking place outside, but he could imagine the tone of his father's voice, calm, measured, and firm. When Mrs. Harper returned a few minutes later, her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a stack of papers. She didn't meet Jamal's eyes as she resumed the lesson, her voice subdued and lacking its usual sharpness. The rest of the class passed without incident, but the atmosphere remained tense. After school, Jamal was called to his father's office. He entered to find Mr. Daniels sitting behind his desk, his expression serious but not unkind. He gestured for Jamal to sit down, and Jamal complied, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Jamal, Mr. Daniels began, I want you to know that I've spoken with Mrs. Harper about her behavior. It's clear that she has been unfairly targeting you, and I won't tolerate that kind of conduct from any teacher in this school. Jamal nodded, relief washing over him. Thank you, Dad. I appreciate you stepping in. Mr. Daniels leaned forward, his expression softening. I also want to say how proud I am of you for handling this situation with such maturity. You could have lashed out or escalated things, but you chose to rise above it. That takes strength. Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. I just wanted to do what was right, he said quietly. But it's been hard. His father reached across the desk, placing a reassuring hand on Jamal's shoulder. I know it has, and I want you to know that you're not alone. If you ever feel like you're being treated unfairly, you have every right to speak up. You deserve to be treated with respect, just like everyone else. Jamal nodded, his resolve strengthening. I'll remember that. The next day, the atmosphere in Mrs. Harper's classroom was markedly different. She was subdued, her usual sharpness replaced by a tone that bordered on cautious politeness. She no longer singled Jamal out, instead treating him with the same level of respect she showed her other students. It was clear that the conversation with Mr. Daniels had left a lasting impression. Word of what had happened spread throughout the school, and many students began to view Jamal in a new light. Some admired his courage, while others envied his ability to stand up for himself. But for Jamal, it wasn't about gaining their approval. It was about doing what was right and proving to himself that he could rise above adversity. In the weeks that followed, Jamal continued to excel in his studies, his confidence growing with each passing day. He no longer allowed Mrs. Harper's actions to define him, instead focusing on his goals and the support of those who believed in him. And though the road had been difficult, he emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. As he walked through the hallways, his head held high, Jamal felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. He had faced the storm and come out on the other side, proving to himself and everyone else that he was capable of greatness. And in that moment, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the same courage and resilience that had carried him through this journey. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel to support more powerful storytelling like this. And don't stop there. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next video. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below to let us know how this story impacted you or what you'd like to see next. Your feedback helps us create meaningful content that connects with you. Thank you for being a part of our community. Your voice matters,